Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special South Radio Network show. We're going to be interviewing Scottie Ogrin, our SAD.NET webmaster and technology expert. Scottie has a master's degree in electric engineering and informatics, and after working in the auto industry and the telecom industry, he became a systems engineer in 2003. He joined SAD as an editor, and today he is the webmaster and chief engineer at SAD.NET. You can find him at his blog at scottiestech.info and also in his YouTube channel. And today we will be discussing a little book that just came across both of us called Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. And Yasha Levine, he is a journalist and author, and he has written for Wired.com and among other publishing companies and magazines. And he does a very interesting job by, well, let's say uncovering the secret history of the internet as a military project for surveillance and monitoring of the internet. So Scottie, you wrote a blog post on scottiestech.info, what you need to know about the internet, and you say pretty much all the big players in the internet tech world got where they are with a little help, and by a little help, I mean a lot. So what do you think of the book? Let's just, your general impression. Was it something new that you learned? Was it, came as a surprise, or what do you think?
Well, yeah, it didn't really come as a surprise to me because, well, let's just say that I've suspected for a long while, that this is how it worked, and I had seen evidence that these things are, when you hear when you watch the movie about Facebook, or you read like a biography of Mark Zuckerberg, for example, and you see how Facebook was founded, it's pretty clear that there are reasons why certain social networks become popular and other ones just kind of fall by the wayside, and that's it.
Right.
Also, when you hear things about like hashing algorithms and cryptographic things, that are promoted by the NSA, the National Security Agency, you kind of tend to see that, well, there's something going on here. So I kind of knew for a while that things were a little bit fishy with the internet in general, and that it was kind of all about surveillance. But Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley, was very eye-opening because he starts way back in like the 1950s, in like the Cold War era. Mm-hmm. And he goes like step by step through all the decades, and I guess you could say that the rabbit hole was deeper than even I thought.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, you can see, he does a great rendition of the history of the internet as a surveillance. First, they use it to, have a better understanding of their opponent during the Vietnam War. And then as the 1960s was coming to an end, they used it as a tool for, all the 60s movement that was also developing the anti-war sentiment. Their main intent was to get a hold of all of these dissidents that were protesting on the streets, as I said, the anti-war movement, and from there, the necessity to have a centralized, way to gather all this information, intelligence-wise, and to share it among the various entities and various agencies. And then the author goes into, he makes a great leap into the network developed, right, through the 70s and 80s. They had a network already in place, but then in the 90s, it took like a turn into a more public and consumer approach. And then we have, some of the big players being born in the 90s, as Google, as Amazon, and Yahoo back then. But then, would you say that it was they got funded as well? I mean, what do you think of the conception of Google? With Sergey Brin being part of Stanford, and ARPA or DARPA having a great presence in that university. How did they sponsor his doctoral thesis, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because you mentioned it started way back in I mentioned the 1950s, and then you mentioned Vietnam. And the interesting thing about that was the way that this whole thing started was that one of the sort of famous events that launched all of this was it was the Vietnam War, and of course, deep in the jungles, the U.S. started getting its butt kicked, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they went in and they said, well, how are we going to fix this? And the solution was to throw a phenomenal amount of money at some new organizations. At that time, it was ARPA. And so what they did is they came up with these crazy ideas, mind you, this is in 1969. So they created a bunch of radio transmitter sensors that looked like the stalks of plants and stuff.
Right.
They were sensing, detecting things like heat, urine,
right,
seismic sensors. And at that time, we're talking 1969. So at that time, that was fairly technologically advanced.
Right.
So they make these sensors and they drop them by the thousands all over the jungle. And then apparently they had all this incredibly fancy building, and inside this building, this sort of intelligence center, they had a 4-story tall color screen that showed like the whole Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah.
And it was insane at that time, the amount of money they put into it, but it was also technically ingenious what they actually did. But the really funny thing about it was that it was an abysmal failure, because the Vietnamese soldiers, they figured out what was happening very quickly. The idea originally was they dropped these sensors all over the jungle, and then these sensors are each transmitting radio signals back to this intelligence center, and the intelligence center is displaying in full color on these, all these little lights that light up. And so every time they saw some area of the jungle light up, they would send American planes in and bomb the crap out of everything.
Yeah.
So as I said, the Vietnamese soldiers very quickly figured out, that's a heat sensor, that's a urine sensor. So what they would do is they would take bags of urine and dump them in places, or they would, light a fire somewhere. They would do all this stuff over here, and then they would route all their troops and equipment the other way. And so it was a phenomenal amount of money and time and technology, and it was even new technology, but no one actually thought about the fact that by using simple common sense, you could circumvent the whole thing. You could get around the whole thing and render it completely and utterly useless. So, and I thought that was very interesting, because I see kind of a similarity today, with the advent of Google and Amazon and everything. There's this idea that you can, you're hoovering up all this information. Everything you do, you're at dinner, your cell phone is on, it's in standby mode, and you're talking about some product or service, and when you get home later that night, suddenly you hop on the internet or you check your mail, and that product or service is being, shoved in your face to try and buy it.
Mm-hmm.
So all this data is being hoovered up, except you kind of have to wonder if it's being done in a similar way, where they have so much data that, what are they going to do with it? Anyway, then you kind of move forward to, I think it was in 1975, there was NBC News came out. There was this report that ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet,
right,
which was created essentially for surveillance, for doing things like, it was the successor basically to this crazy stuff that happened in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So I love this ARPANET. It connects all these different, the White House, the FBI, all these different agencies together, the military, the intelligence agencies, everybody. It hooks them all together. And as you said, they were tracking protesters.
Yeah.
So they talk about this on the evening news on NBC television in the U.S. In June, something like June 2nd, 1975, this happened.
Pretty early on.
Yeah, and they came out and they said, look, they're tracking Americans, they're tracking American citizens who are protesters, and they're doing, and it's, this should be illegal. And it was like a 2 or 3 night long affair where they kept reporting more and more because there were leaks from inside the Pentagon, with inside, the NSA, the CIA or whatever. Kind of like with, the Snowden revelations and all that kind of stuff. This was way back in 1975. And of course, there's a lot of hullabaloo for a while, and then it kind of dies down and everyone forgets about it. Yeah,
what happened was that, even though it was on the evening news and some action was taken, there were congressional hearings, they were asking questions, some congressmen and congresswomen were worried about this, and nothing came out as a consequence. That didn't stop anyone from continuing with this activity, and we can also see that happening. I mean, Zuckerberg went to Congress recently, right? And for a slightly different reason. But are you going to say that Facebook has stopped doing those same activities for which Zuckerberg went to Congress? I will definitely say no. So even though, Yasha Levine, the author, makes the same case, nothing comes out of these congressional hearings. Nothing comes out of Facebook has faced also severe or supposedly severe sanctions or penalties for how they manage their information. But yeah, it's like a slap in the wrist, right?
Yeah, and it's, you mentioned Google earlier. This all happened. What I was just talking about happened in 1975. Fast forward, 20 years, and the internet hits, and then you have, as you were saying, the creation of Google, and it was funded by DARPA. Larry Page writes a PhD thesis, and that PhD thesis was funded by DARPA. DARPA, of course, being kind of the successor to ARPA, who was back in the day dropping the sensors in Vietnam and all this. And the whole idea with the interesting thing about that, for me anyway, is that at that time the internet was very young. And so you had other search engines like Alta Vista and Lycos, and he mentions in the book that Lycos was actually also funded by the Carnegie, some foundation or something, which was also tied to the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. But these first search engines were more like directories, almost like a phone book.
Yeah.
Where, I remember using them when I was in college, and it's like you would type a search term, and it was kind of like looking up in a phone book. There wasn't any real intelligence to it. So it seems that DARPA looked at this and said, hey, everyone's going to be using the internet, so we're going to fund this Larry Page guy because he had an idea, and his idea was PageRank. And PageRank was the reason that Google, more or less, the reason Google became a hit. Yeah. Because PageRank is something where you have all these websites on the internet, and Google was categorizing all of these links. So they were saying, well, okay, like say you have your own website, and if high quality websites are linking to you, of course at that time, newspapers like the New York Times and everything, they didn't all have websites yet, but in the modern era, we see a similar kind of thing happening. If mainstream media news outlets are linking to you, then Google still prioritizes you and says, these mainstream people think that you're important, so therefore you are. Mm-hmm. They can be lying through their teeth about whatever. They can be reporting completely fake news, whatever. But if they point to you, then Google pays more attention to you. And that's essentially what PageRank was way back in the very early days of Google. And I think that's pretty much why DARPA funded it, because it was all about control, because they realized that this internet thing was coming, and more people, people of that time had maybe AOL dial-up service, and the internet was its very early days.
Mm-hmm.
But they realized what was coming, and they wanted a way to control information. But the other part of it was that Google was also being used to hoover up all kinds of data. It was trying to track everything that you were doing, and at that time it was very, very simple.
Yeah.
Eventually, Levine talks in the book about the release of Gmail, and Gmail was interesting because Google says, "Hey, we're going to give everyone free webmail."
Yeah.
And you got I think it was 1 gigabyte of storage space, which at the time was just completely absurd.
It was.
Yeah. And that, there was kind of there were some problems at the time because everyone said, "Oh, this is really evil."
Yeah.
And the reason was because Google was actually, they'll give you a free mail service and you have all the storage space to keep your mail. But even if you didn't have a Gmail account, if someone else sent an email to you, they would look at your IP address, because very often when you send emails from a server, your public IP address from your internet service provider is actually sent along as one of the headers in the email.
Yeah.
So that they'd have your email address, they'd have your public IP address, they'd have various information, everything that you wrote in an email to this other person who has a Gmail account. They would take all that information. So they weren't just tracking people who had Gmail accounts, they were tracking everyone else who sent any email to a Gmail user. And so it all kind of ballooned into
all sorts of different services. It's not just Gmail. We have now Google Docs, and we have Google Calendar. I mean, they have the whole suite of like Office-like applications. They have this meeting application. They have integrated into G Suite, which will go into the information of companies and all of that. So it's not just consumers; it's consumers plus enterprises or companies. An interesting question that I was asking myself, just as I was finishing reading the book, was, okay, so people in the 70s and the 60s, they were protesting, and they were saying this is another way of the government of doing what we are, afraid. Their surveillance is coming and it's taking technological proportions. But all of a sudden, the 80s came, and as the internet becomes more public and open for consumption of the masses, the message we hear is not that message anymore. The message we hear is the internet is so cool, the internet is so democratizing, the internet will set us free. I mean, I find very fascinating how that came along, because we have all these evangelists saying this is so great, it's going to change the face of the earth, literally, quite literally. But people tend to forget that behind all of this, hype, we have the same actors and the same motivations as those people in the 70s were afraid of. I mean, to me, that's a sales pitch that is pretty amazing, don't you think?
Yeah, that's actually the evangelism point is actually kind of important, I think, because even way back when, in the 50s and 60s, it's like with the Vietnam thing. When they did that, there was always like one guy or a small group of people who, in many cases, they weren't actually like techies, really. There was one guy that Levine writes about in the book. He was regarded as a highly skilled psychologist, but he was also seen as a kind of a technology evangelist, a futurist.
Right.
And he became one of these people who was running around getting everybody worked up. And that's one of the reasons why you have these, I guess, like sociopathic or even psychopathic types who they find themselves in these positions of power, heading vast quantities of money and techie talent, let's say, and they're doing these crazy things that are, like dropping the sensors in the jungle, and it ends up, it's a phenomenal. That whole system cost something like $3 billion,
Right.
back in the late '60s, I think like 5 billion, which in today's monetary terms is like $30 billion.
Crazy amount.
And then as time went on, you had more of this. And back in the '90s, like the early '90s, it was Wired magazine. And he talks about this in the book too, how there were a couple guys, I can't remember their names, but some of them are in jail now. They were basically running around. They weren't engineers. They weren't, computer scientists. They didn't actually really know what they were talking about, but they knew enough, and they had certain types of personalities or whatever, where they were given these huge salaries to run around and evangelize. And I remember, like when I was in like junior high and high school, reading this new Wired magazine, and like, isn't this amazing? And I picked it up and I read it, and it was, they're talking about virtual reality is the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember this. You would go to a store and you could buy a VHS tape of the virtual reality future. Look at these wonderful computer graphics, and all anyone could talk about was virtual reality. And that's one of the things that these evangelists were promoting. And of course, here we are,
25 years later.
Yeah. And there's virtual reality is only now becoming a thing. And it's basically for playing video games with the visor that you can put on. You can play like a 3D video game in real time, and they still cost a fortune.
Right.
And that was a kind of a harmless thing. I mean, it didn't really cause any harm, but a lot of these things are pushed by these evangelist types. And I mean, obviously we see results that are not so good, like with the mass spying. And then someone like Edward Snowden comes out and he reveals the man behind the curtain to some extent. And then he does something like promote Tor and Signal, which is a whole other thing that Levine talks about in his book.
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit about Snowden, because of course, one of the before getting into that, one of the things that the book left out, I think, is that, well, it doesn't, talk about Facebook that much, but Facebook was also, sponsored by InQtel, this venture capitalist arm of the CIA. They talk about how DARPA was really, really, right there at the beginning, while Google was, just starting. But then in 2013, we have Editor Snowden, and he, in a sort of way, reveals the man behind the curtain. We already knew to some degree that the surveillance and massive spying was happening, but then he reveals, the real names of the programs, the supposedly the reach of the programs. But at the same time, he is like a super supporter of Tor and the Tor network and all of, supposedly these crypto tools that are going to, give us an extra layer or a total, it's going to stop all the spying for those users that are into this type of, with the mentality of trying to get a privacy on the internet. But then this guy, then the author speaks of Tor being actually a government program as well, since its inception. Isn't that fancy? I mean, come on. I found that totally mind-blowing, don't you think?
Yeah, that was pretty interesting, because for those who don't really know much about Tor, it was essentially something that apparently the military intelligence groups created. Surprise! And the idea was that they wanted a whole bunch of servers, and they wanted to be able to do nefarious things on the internet. So they had a whole bunch of servers, and Tor was kind of like encrypted connections between all these different nodes and the network, and you could sort of kind of like bounce your signal between different servers, if you want to think of it that way. So you would hide where you're actually coming from, and so this would allow you to do evil things, right? So they quickly realized that This time they actually used some common sense and they went, right, this is great, except that if all the servers we're using are only, IP addresses associated with, the military, the intelligence agencies, that's obviously not going to work because everyone's going to know where we're coming from. So they said, I know, let's popularize Tor. Let's tell everyone that Tor is super, super secure, and that if you want to hide yourself on the internet so you can do evil things or even just surf the web in total anonymity, this is what you should do. And I mean, I remember looking at Tor and going, yeah, that's got to be fake, because every time I hear something about if you use this service, it's super safe, it's super secure. Same thing with like PGP encryption for emails.
Right.
Any technology that's widely available and that is widely promoted, I don't care if people say it's like the greatest encryption in the universe. If it's widely promoted, then chances are, according to Levine's book, chances are that it's actually most likely created and promoted by intelligence agencies and types like DARPA and everything, usually for their own ends.
Yeah.
And the really interesting part was where the Tor was used by, I forget the guy's name now, but he was the one who made the whole Silk Road thing where people were selling like drugs and sex and like all kinds of stuff. It was kind of part of this like dark web.
Right.
And it was criminal activity.
Yeah.
And this guy made huge sums of money, and he was like just like famous for being this sort of dark web badass, basically. And he ended up going to jail because the authorities in the U.S. they basically gave themselves up and said, no, well, actually, we do have access to Tor. We hacked it, sort of. Obviously, they didn't need to because they created it, so they could always see what was going on.
Yeah.
And the guy is now in jail.
Yeah.
So they come up with a system. They need a way for everyone else to adopt it so they can hijack their computers to do evil things. So they push it to the masses. The masses, lap it up and use it. And then this poor guy uses it to do all this illegal stuff. And then they out themselves by saying, oh, yeah, no, that's actually not super secure. And by the way, this guy's going to jail. And yet people still use it. They still think that it's super secure.
Yeah.
That kind of blew my mind, actually.
Yeah, because, this guy was counting on this technology because one of the main, reasons to promote it is, it's because it's open source. Basically meaning that the code is available for anyone to see, so there's nothing to hide. But again, you could be the NSA or someone. First of all, if you're funding it, then you have people working on this piece of code 24/7, let's just say, and you could have a room of programmers trying to crack this technology that you funded in the first place, and then how hard it is for anyone to understand that if you have 1 year working on this, you could probably, or with a certain degree of certainty, to crack Tor's encryption code. I mean, most of the encryption that we see used on the web was developed by the military agencies anyway. So it will be very dumb for them not to have a backdoor or a way to crack it already. So this guy was super certain that he was, being protected by the shroud of secrecy behind the Tor project's anonymity, only to find himself now serving 2 life sentences. And of course, the reputation of Tor should be right now, down to 0, but still people think it's a secure way of communicating. And not only that, it could be a honeypot of criminals, right? They will think, oh yeah, it's super secure to use this, and only to have the federal agents knocking on their door the next day, as it happened with this guy. But also they will promote, regime change as well, because they will tell supposedly quote unquote freedom fighters to use this technology to disrupt maybe a country and to bring about a revolution or whatnot, right?
Yeah, that's actually brings up another good point that he talks about in the book, because you mentioned regime change, and that's something that also goes back, way back to the Cold War. Um, all of this stuff has always been used to track people who dissent, but it's actually way worse than that, because all of this was associated with intelligence agencies. Like, for example, in Vietnam, there was also this whole kind of scheme they had, where they brought in all these people, and they were trying to psychoanalyze the Vietnamese. But the way that they did it was they assumed that the Vietnamese are not like us. They're basically mindless robots. They're purely rational. And so, because they're just sort of logical robots, we can do certain things and they will react in a specific way. There was no sense of it was, the American side was saying, well, the Vietnamese don't understand patriotism. They don't have any emotion. They don't have any love of country. They're just mindless drones
that are for their own interest, right? I mean, they assume that they will so rational that they will put their own benefit before anything else.
Yeah, and so then what they ended up doing is they ended up having counterinsurgency is a word that was very popular at the time, and it keeps coming up throughout the book, and it's the same stuff that continues today, where they started like kidnapping people, they started torturing people, they came up with these idiotic social engineering schemes, and it was like coincident with these technological advances and these crazy people in charge of this stuff. You also had these kind of psychological operations, and those two have been merged together since the beginning. So, fast forward to today, and it's very clear why and how all these things work. I mean, you hear about, so-and-so analyzed, Facebook, and people are addicted to Facebook and posting images of the meals that they just ate. Or Amazon. Amazon is designed to get you to click things, and, all the psychological things. It's always been used to make money.
Yep.
But it's also always been used to try and control people and hoover up as much information as possible. And it's fascinating, actually, because it's all completely nuts.
Yeah, and that's a funny thing, because right from the beginning, the author also says this was done to predict behavior, as you were mentioning with the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and they were trying to, so to speak, crack their code to understand their behavior, and maybe because the basic question they were asking is, why are they so reluctant to American-style democracy, and they could not understand, and they tried to understand it through machines, right? But and of course that has been happening all along. I mean, applied to marketing, applied to consumerism, but also politically. So the natural conclusion, if you want, is that they will use this for in an election. And the funny thing is that even though with all this information and behavioral patterns, algorithms, and all of that, they could not predict, or they could not stop Donald Trump from being elected. And I find that fascinating, right? Maybe we could talk about Edward Snowden, and what do you think of him being, perhaps a useful idiot? And because Sot has been very skeptic of Snowden since the beginning, how he, flew to Hong Kong and then to Russia, and then he was disclosing things, but apparently he is, presented as this super duper technical guy, almost a genius guy, and at the time, now that he's so famous, now that he has so much credibility, he is promoting useless apps like Signal and Tor. So that kind of make you think that he was a useful leader since the beginning, right?
Yeah, he's kind of an interesting case because from the very beginning, when he came out and all his revelations happened, and when I read that he was, they get to the hotel, Glenn Greenwald or whatever, and he says, "Here, everybody, put your phones inside this microwave oven," and that just kind of struck me as like, huh? Because microwave ovens work at a frequency that's very close to 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth, for example. But you can do a very simple test yourself where you take your smartphone or regular cell phone, put it inside your microwave oven and try to call it, and most of the time it will ring. Mm-hmm. So it's like anybody who knows anything about that kind of stuff could tell you that like a microwave oven and a refrigerator, if you want to be absolutely sure that device is blocked, that's not going to cut it. Now, at first I thought, well, yeah, but I mean, maybe he's better at programming and like hacking stuff. And but I watched the documentary with him, and then also the movie about him. And and the more I read, it really kind of struck me like. And then, as you said, after he's promoting Tor and Signal, and it's like, I don't know if he was a useful idiot, did he really actually want to do something good, and so he did, and then the agency took advantage of that. But it's is he? I don't know. Some people have suggested that he was an intentional leak. I think that's a little bit absurd. The idea that everything is precisely controlled.
Right.
That's a nice fantasy to subscribe to sometimes, because if you think that there's some grandmaster plan and everything, and I think most of the time it's just a bunch of kind of psychotypes vying for power, and you have a guy like him who maybe goes, geez, this is wrong. I mean, supposedly he decided it was wrong. Well, he didn't seem to think it was wrong for a long time, and then suddenly he grew a conscience. Well, okay, maybe that's possible. I mean, things like that happen. But he was kind of a strange case, and I don't think people have suggested we ought to throw him in prison, or we should send somebody to assassinate him, and that kind of adds to this mystique. It only contributes to everyone thinking that he knows so much more than he can say and everything. And I don't think that's true at all. I think he did his thing and that's it. I don't think he's actually a threat to anyone. Mm-hmm. If anything, he was kind of a low-level operative, and there's probably a lot more that he really knows nothing about.
Right.
But it was interesting how he was promoting, and I think his promotion of things like Tor and Signal, I think it's just like the microwave oven. He really didn't understand that this was already, that Tor was created by the military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, and they promoted it, and he simply didn't know that because he was, more of like a peon in the intelligence community. So I'm glad he did what he did, because at least for a time, it brought people's attention back. But that's one of the things that really kind of frustrated me about Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley. It's like, read over decades and decades. Like the one thing I mentioned, the NBC television revelation in 1975 about the ARPANET and how they were collecting data on protesters and stuff. That happens again and again and again. It's like every 5-10 years there's this big to do about it, and like as you mentioned with Mark Zuckerberg, going to Washington D.C. and he's got to testify, and he looks nervous, which I think he's kind of a robot, so I don't think he ever looks nervous. But, and it happens again and again, and people are so concerned for like about 5 minutes,
right?
And then they forget all about it, and it's just business as usual. Which I'm hoping that at some point there'll be kind of a critical mass will be, they'll reach a critical mass of unhappiness with the whole situation, or they'll finally push things one step too far. But yeah, that was, I think, one of the first most shocking thing was just the actual history, the fact that everything, beyond anything that I had thought, it's always been about surveillance. As I said, much worse than I ever imagined even. The second thing was the utter absurdity of things that they did, that they wasted so much money on this stuff. They can't cure cancer, but they can spend, $30 billion on a system that doesn't even work, and that's like pocket change. It doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
And then finally, the third thing that shocked me the most was the fact that this stuff has come up like again and again and again, and no one ever really, it's like they've never had enough of it for some reason.
Yeah.
They just kind of hem and haw and go, oh my God, that's like so horrible. And then just go back to life as usual. And it just carries on. And until people decide they've had enough.
Yeah. And they have a false sense that someone is actually looking after this. I mean, on one side, it's, pretty difficult for an average guy or an average person to, disconnect from the internet because education, their jobs and their entertainment, pretty much it's embedded into everyday life, and it's going to be very hard. So you kind of need like a soothing voice that will tell you that everything is going to be okay. So we have Zuckerberg, and we have the guys at Google saying, yeah, one of the main problems for the internet right now is the mass surveillance that the government is performing. And to me, that's just appalling, because of course these guys, they were sponsored by government intelligence agencies. They know that they have access to their data, and yet they present themselves as champions of freedom and privacy. Of course, that also is, speaks volumes of hypocrisy. But yeah, it's like a damage control type of situation in which, from time to time, you have these massive revelations and reminders that, there is no privacy on the internet. Just the very fact that, for instance, Signal is on the Google store, that means something, right? I mean, if it was, as you said, is widely available, so how come someone is actually, posting this on a Google store, which will, and it's run on an Android phone that, and the source code is, of course, owned by Google. I mean, come on, right? I mean, it's like a circus of the absurd, in which people have this, and Yasha Levine makes this point as well. It's a false sense of security, in which someone is telling you, yeah, we are freedom fighters and privacy fighters for you, and never mind that we are actually owning these companies and making billions with your own data. And at the same time, that you have all these tools that actually are worth for nothing in the end, right?
Yeah, and it's it's pretty crazy.
It's pretty depressive, but yet someone might be asking you, well, okay, yeah, the internet is has since the beginning this purpose, but of course it's not all bad, right? I mean, is it still worth using the internet as we're using it right now? That will be, probably a question in everyone's mind after this little chat.
Yeah, well, I think yeah. I mean, of course, because I mean, I don't know about most people, but like I've met extraordinary people via the internet. I'm webmaster of several, I hope, important websites. I mean, I have my own blog, and I started my techie blog because I realized in my day-to-day life that I learned all kinds of stuff. Simple things like how to fix some little problem in Windows, to more complex stuff about electronics or whatever. And I started it because I realized that I had all this, people were asking me questions about how to fix things in regular life, friends, family, whatever. And I had the answer. And I thought, well, I've got all this knowledge stuff in my head, so maybe I should start a blog and put it out there. And I did. And, most people, it's kind of like we all do, you want your answers. So you hop on Google and you do a search and you find a solution. And you're so happy to have a solution to your problem that you don't actually take the time to write and say, hey, thanks for that. That really helped me. If you don't like what the person says, you're like 90 times more likely to write a mean message to them, but kind messages.
Right.
In our modern society, those are few and far between. And I actually get a lot of them. And every time I get one, it actually makes me quite happy that I've helped somebody out. And also just the sheer amount of information that's available on the internet. It's, Google Maps is evil in a sense. I mean, if you're signed in with your Google account or you're using Gmail, and every website has Google Analytics, literally everything you do and say is tracked and recorded and categorized and processed, filtered. But at the same time, when I want to know how to get somewhere, well, Google Maps is pretty handy because I'm pretty bad at navigating. So, and also just, we see it today with, Trump gets elected president of the U.S. There's just all this chaos. There's social chaos. There's political chaos. And suddenly we're seeing that, the whole fake news thing came up. And it's like finally everyone is realizing that the mainstream media is full of crap. And
right.
So they're turning to alternative news. And that's something that wouldn't be possible, even like YouTube. I have my little YouTube channel, whatever. But someone like, all these people, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, he said point blank that he and other recent popular figures, they're using
dark web, they call them.
What's that?
The intellectual dark web.
Yeah, the intellect. I don't really like that name because I'm not sure why you would want to associate yourself with the dark web, but whatever. But it's like their popularity is basically due to the internet, and it's like if all this had happened in Canada, we might read about it in a newspaper. The gender pronoun thing and Peterson's fight against it, and then all these other figures come up, and it's a very effective way to reach lots of people. And if you want to know how to do anything, there's a YouTube video for it.
Yeah.
You don't, you want to fix a specific. I use it for. I'll give you an example. I fix lots of computers, so. Somebody hands me their laptop or their smartphone and says, here's the problem, this drive is bad or the battery needs to be replaced or something. In the past, I would be lucky if I could find the technical drawings and documents that show me exactly how to open it, where the screws are. Today, you hand me any phone or laptop or other electronic device, and I can go on YouTube and search for it with the word tear down or disassembly. And I will find a video of somebody showing exactly how to take the thing apart, exactly where all the screws are. That's something that used to take me hours. Those are very practical things, but there are also, there are, finding like-minded individuals, sharing information about stuff, sharing knowledge. We are all actually connected. And I think in a sense, it's kind of backfiring. Time will tell how much or if I'm right about this, but I think that the kind of big network and the interconnectedness and the ability to share all this information and knowledge is in the end actually going to result in not what the bad guys are hoping for. They're hoping for total control. They're hoping that if they use their vacuum and they suck up more and more data, that at some point they will have total control. And I think they don't really realize that that's simply not possible, because when you think about how much you would need to know about a person, it's not enough to know metadata. It's not enough to know that they like to eat this kind of pizza, or that they like blue tennis, or that they, their girlfriend's name is Barbara or something. It's not enough to know what they buy, or whatever. You have to, like, a person is incredibly complex. You have to understand, like, every little nuance of their, like, emotional natures and their past history. There are things in their past that if they never talk about, you don't know. So the bad guys, let's call them, have this idea that they can get more and more information, and it's kind of the traditional thing. Like, it's the standard sort of, I want total control, and in order to have total control, I want total information awareness. And the very idea of total information awareness is utterly absurd, because it's impossible. Just the information you would need to know about one person would fill millions of rooms full of Google servers.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, that's what they are hoping for with all this information, right? But yeah, the possibility is there that they will fail, just as they failed trying to understand the North Vietnamese, or how they tried, to a certain degree, direct the voters for Hillary Clinton and not to Donald Trump. That didn't work either. So that's what you're saying, I think. I mean, in the end, as much as information, I mean, we could assume that everything we're doing is going to be monitored or spied upon to a certain degree, or to a greater degree. But anyhow, maybe their plans will not work out in the end, because, of course, as you're saying, people are complex, and they don't function in large groups as they function on an individual basis. So, predicting and trying to reduce this to an algorithm can prove to be very hard, but they will try nonetheless, right?
oh yeah, they're still trying. They're not going to stop trying. But it's you mentioned the election, and that's really really interesting, because I mean, I remember, I went to bed the night of the last U.S. presidential election, and I was like, when I wake up in the morning, Hillary's going to be president. I didn't vote. It was like, man, this is all just because, in previous elections, it was like the debold voting machine, and it's hanging chads and all this. I mean, it's been obvious for a long time. I would hope to most people that politics is rigged, even without voting machines, electronic voting machines being rigged. The fact that, like, money and corporations essentially buy seats, and then once that politician is in office, they basically do things to favor the corporation, and I mean, it's all just utterly messed up, all the way up to the president of the United States. So when everyone in the media was screaming that Hillary had a 97% chance of winning and Trump had a 3% chance of winning, and I wake up the next morning and somebody told me that Trump had won, like, I didn't believe it. I thought it was a joke.
Right.
And then you actually see the numbers and you go, well, that means that all of the, Russian hacking, Russia hacked our election. Well, no, it was corporate interests, and this whole vast network of power that does all these crazy things wanted her to be president, and it failed. And that's, of course, why they hate Trump so much, because he wasn't supposed to be the president, except he is. And that was actually, I think, almost like a turning point, because, I mean, I'm not saying that Trump is going to save the world, because probably he's not. I doubt he'll even be able to do much in the U.S., but, well, that remains to be seen. But it really was interesting, because it's, things do change. Maybe they don't change the way that we want them to, and I mean, obviously, there's no privacy and security on the internet. So what do? You can take certain precautions. You
Hmm.
know, you have to realize that when you're sending a person an email, even if you're not using Gmail or whatever, it's not safe. It's not secure. So don't say things via email that you don't want the whole world to know about. Um, at the same time, there are ways to use email securely, and it has nothing to do with encryption. Um, so you have to be careful. You have to be aware. Um, learn as much as possible about how all this stuff works without making your head explode. Because I realize, we're not all techies. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think like just as with Russia going into Syria and suddenly it was like things totally shifted in the Middle East. I think Trump's election, the reason it caused so much chaos that's continuing to this day, is because it was kind of like an earthquake event.
Yeah.
What will actually happen? We don't know. I mean, it could be another 10, 20, 30 years of more nonsense, or I don't know. But I would say that in every respect, and for sure from the technical side of things, I'm far more optimistic than I am pessimistic, and I really shouldn't be, because the more I learn, the more amazed I am. But then, here we are talking, and
Discussing this.
people are going to watch, and they're going to discuss, and they're going to want to read the book, and they'll probably be amazed too, and then they'll tell their friends, and
Yeah.
we'll see.
We'll see. Well, yeah, I think, as you said, we have to be aware. That's the key word here. No pun intended. and and in the end, having all this information is very useful. And we have to assume that the moment we buy a new telephone, the moment we buy a new computer, I mean, it goes way. There's a lot of information that is going to be gathered. So let's not pretend. I mean, that's one of the key points in the book as well, because a lot of people are believing that they are secure. They have this false sense of security. But let's not pretend. I mean, that's one of the. Let's not lie to ourselves in that way, pretending that we are safe. For those that are, privacy concerned, and for the rest of them that are, they don't care, maybe caring a little bit more, it should be beneficial also to understand that, yeah, the government and the big companies are all together in this for different reasons, different purposes, cross purposes, for, selling you something to understand you better, to try to direct your behavior towards something, to discredit worthy information. In the news we hear, it's a lot of misinformation about how the world works. So even though the internet has become this scary place in many aspects, there are some other in which there is a little light at the end of the tunnel that we can also find truthful and good information. So yeah, so being aware is like the only thing that we could actively do as individuals. And to discuss, as you mentioned, this kind of books is very, very beneficial for everyone. So any last thoughts, Scottie, on the issue before we close?
No,
We're good?
I think we're good.
All right. So thanks everyone for listening. And as we tend to say during our Spanish show, pay attention to the signs. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.